No one saw Nathan Cole as he stood on the edge of the scrapyard, shoulders hunched against the early morning chill, the first rays of light slanting across the weeds and broken metal. He looked out at the endless clutter, rusted wagons, old farm tools, and the skeletons of machines that had given up long ago, his heart a hollow ache inside his chest. He had never imagined life could unravel like this, so thoroughly and so quickly, leaving him nothing but memories and a shadow of who he used to be. A cold wind cut through Nathan's tattered jacket, making him shiver. Beside him, Storm, his dapple gray Mustang, shifted his weight and blew out a cloud of frosty breath. Nathan reached up, his hand moving with familiar ease to stroke Storm's neck. "We're not quitters, are we, old boy?" he murmured, the words hanging in the air between man and horse, as if Storm truly understood. And maybe he did. Maybe only Storm really knew the depths to which Nathan had sunk. Once, Nathan had been a proud man, a soldier, a craftsman, a husband and father. Now he was nothing more than a survivor scraping by on the edges of a small town that barely remembered his name. After the war, he had tried to build a new life with his hands, opening a modest carpentry business, pouring heart and sweat into every table, chair, and cradle. But tragedy has a way of finding a man, and it found Nathan, first with the loss of his wife to illness, then the slow, bitter drifting apart from his only daughter, Rachel, until the phone stopped ringing and the house grew silent. With his spirit battered and hope worn thin, Nathan watched his business collapse under debts and bad luck. Now, all he had left was Storm and a few coins jingling in his pocket, hope's final echo. He walked further into the scrapyard, the frozen ground crunching beneath his boots. Caleb, the owner, a wiry man with a smoker's cough and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much, watched from a battered chair by the door of a sagging shack. Nathan gave him a nod, the sort men exchanged when pride was too thin for words. "I heard you're looking for work, Nate," Caleb called, his voice rough as gravel. "Ain't much here but junk and ghosts." Nathan managed a crooked smile. "Thought I'd see what was left anyway." They wandered among the skeletons of old wagons, the wind stirring up the sharp tang of rust and oil. Most were beyond saving, wheels sunk in mud, frames rotted through. But there, at the back of the yard, half hidden beneath a tangle of wild vines, Nathan saw it, a wagon, once proud, now reduced to a shell of peeling paint and splintered wood. Something about it called to him, a whisper of possibility in the wreckage. He knelt beside it, running his hand along the side. The wood was rough and split in places, iron fittings eaten with rust, but the frame was sturdy. Nathan imagined what it might have looked like in its prime, painted bright, polished wheels, a family laughing as they rumbled down a sunlit road. He looked up at Caleb, who shrugged. "Belonged to a family, used to farm out near Cedar Hill," Caleb said, almost gently. "Been sitting here ever since they lost the place. Folks say it's cursed. I just say it's tired." Nathan knew that kind of tired. He felt it in his bones. Still, as he gazed at the wagon, a flicker of stubborn hope lit inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could make something of this, give the wagon a new purpose and himself along with it. Maybe this heap of wood and iron was a mirror of his own brokenness, waiting for a steady hand to rebuild it. "How much?" Nathan asked, voice rough. Caleb squinted at him, then at the horse behind him. "For you? $100. Take it or leave it, but I ain't hauling it. You want it, you move it yourself." Nathan's last savings. He didn't hesitate. "Deal." That afternoon, with the weak winter sun overhead, Nathan led Storm over to the wagon, looping a makeshift harness from old rope and frayed leather. Storm snorted, tossing his mane, but stood steady as Nathan worked, as if understanding the importance of the moment. Nathan coaxed the wagon's ruined wheels to move, Storm digging in, hooves churning up mud and dead leaves. It took every ounce of strength they had. But finally, inch by stubborn inch, they dragged the battered relic away from its grave of weeds. By dusk, Nathan and Storm found shelter in an abandoned barn on the edge of the yard. The barn's roof sagged, letting in thin streams of orange light, and the air was sharp with the smell of mold and old straw. Nathan brushed Storm down, whispering quiet thanks, then spread out his worn bedroll in a corner. He shared the last of his bread with Storm, tearing the loaf in half, pressing his forehead to the horse's strong shoulder. That night, as the wind howled and rain battered the barn's walls, Nathan lay awake, staring up at the cracked rafters. He thought about the life he'd lost, the family he'd let slip through his fingers. He thought about Storm, the one soul who hadn't left him, and the ruined wagon now waiting outside, silent and full of secrets. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would begin again. Tomorrow, with Storm by his side, he would fight his way back from the bottom. As Nathan drifted toward uneasy sleep, Storm shifted closer, standing guard in the shadows. In the darkness, the bond between man and horse, tempered by hardship, unspoken but unbreakable, held fast. And somewhere beneath the sorrow and fatigue, a stubborn ember of hope began to glow again. The first steps of a long, uncertain journey had finally begun. By the time the gray light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, Nathan was already awake, the ache in his shoulders a dull reminder of yesterday's struggle. Rain still pattered against the sagging roof, the world beyond the barn soaked and silent except for the low, steady breathing of Storm nearby. Nathan pushed himself up, shaking the chill from his bones, and reached into his pack for the last of the oats he'd saved. He poured them carefully into Storm's feed bag, the act both routine and sacred, a quiet promise that as long as Nathan drew breath, Storm would never go hungry. Storm lifted his head, dark eyes meeting Nathan's gaze with a kind of quiet wisdom. Nathan offered a small, tired smile, rubbing the horse's muzzle with calloused hands. In moments like these, words felt unnecessary. They'd been through enough together, battles both on distant fields and within the broken corners of Nathan's heart, that a single touch conveyed everything: gratitude, loyalty, and the stubborn will to survive. Outside, the world had the washed-out, muddy look of late winter. Nathan shrugged into his coat. Teeth gritted against the cold, and set about checking the wagon. He ran his hands over every splintered board and loose nail, cataloging the damage. Most men would have walked away from such a wreck. The wagon's paint had faded to ghostly streaks of green, its wheels nearly fused to the earth by years of neglect. But Nathan saw possibility, a framework waiting to be rebuilt, not unlike his own battered spirit. Storm nosed at Nathan's pockets, searching for another treat. Then stood quietly as Nathan unloaded what few belongings he had: an old hammer, a handful of bent nails, and a spool of thick, fraying twine. Nathan began clearing out the wagon bed, pulling away rotted boards and tossing aside heaps of debris. He worked with slow, deliberate movements, the pain in his back flaring with each lift, sweat beading along his brow despite the cold. All the while, Storm watched from just outside the barn, his ears flicking at every creak and clatter. ever the silent sentinel. They shared what food they had: a slice of stale bread for Nathan, a carrot for Storm. Nathan leaned back against the wagon, breath coming in ragged bursts. He stared at the ruined barn beams above and remembered nights spent in comfort and warmth. His family gathered around the fire, Rachel's laughter bright as spring sunlight. That world felt impossibly distant now, faded by loss and regret. Yet even as despair threatened to claim him, Nathan drew strength from Storm's unwavering presence. The horse pressed close, nuzzling his shoulder, the steady weight of his companionship anchoring Nathan in the moment. As the days blurred one into the next, Nathan and Storm settled into a rhythm shaped by necessity and trust. Nathan spent long hours scavenging wood from the barn's collapsing stalls and rusted hinges from forgotten doors. Each night after the work was done, he tended Storm with gentle care, cleaning mud from his hooves, combing the dust from his coat. Sometimes Nathan spoke aloud, sharing half-remembered stories from the war or quiet confessions meant for no ears but Storm's. The horse listened without judgment, his eyes reflecting understanding that ran deeper than words. One evening, after a particularly hard day hauling scrap from the yard, Nathan limped back to the barn and found Storm waiting by the open door, a small bramble caught in his mane. Nathan chuckled, untangling the knot with patient hands. "You and me, partner. We're all we got," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion he rarely let surface. Storm answered by nuzzling Nathan's cheek, the warmth of his breath a balm against the cold. It wasn't all quiet struggle and unspoken understanding. There were moments when exhaustion and hunger pushed Nathan to the edge, when frustration boiled over and he kicked at a broken wheel or cursed the sky for all it had taken from him. In those moments, Storm remained steadfast, a living reminder that Nathan wasn't as alone as he sometimes felt. When the world grew too heavy, Storm would sidle close, the weight of his head settling on Nathan's shoulder, grounding him in the here and now. Caleb, the scrapyard owner, occasionally appeared at the barn's threshold, his presence signaled by the rasp of his boots on gravel and the faint smell of pipe smoke. He didn't say much, just left a bundle of old blankets or a battered canteen within easy reach, his nod a quiet vote of confidence in Nathan's efforts. It wasn't charity, it was respect, the kind that came from recognizing a fellow survivor. Nathan was grateful for the small gestures, even if pride kept him from saying so aloud. Winter gave way, little by little, to the promise of spring. The earth thawed, the air softened, and the barn felt less like a tomb and more like a haven. Storm's coat gleamed in the slanting sunlight, muscles rippling beneath the surface as he stretched and trotted in the open field beside the barn. Nathan watched him, hope stirring quietly within his chest, a fragile thing, but growing stronger with each passing day. Their bond, forged in hardship and silence, became the foundation on which Nathan began to rebuild. Not just a wagon, but a life. Every scrape of the plane across raw wood, every brush of Storm's nose against his hand, was a reminder that even at rock bottom, a man could choose to stand up again. Nathan didn't know what the future held, but with Storm by his side, he was willing to find out, one small victory at a time. Each morning, Nathan awoke to the sound of Storm's steady breathing and the faint creaks of the old barn settling in the sun. With every new day, the rhythm of rebuilding became more ingrained, small acts of care for Storm, then hours of slow labor as Nathan tried to bring the battered wagon back to life. Though his hands ached and his back complained, Nathan pushed forward, finding solace in the ritual and the quiet company of his horse. There was comfort in having a purpose, even if it was as fragile and uncertain as the cracked timbers beneath his fingers. As winter's chill began to retreat, the world outside softened. Patches of grass emerged in the yard. Birds returned, filling the mornings with hesitant song. Nathan worked in this quiet landscape, scraping away the layers of decay from the wagon's frame, piecing together what he could salvage and improvising when there was nothing left to save. Storm stayed close, watching Nathan with curious eyes, sometimes cropping grass or nosing through the old straw for hidden treats. One afternoon, after hours spent prying loose rusted bolts and hauling away rotten boards, Nathan let himself rest in the shade beside the barn. Storm wandered over, hooves thumping softly on packed earth, and stood near Nathan, ears flicking forward as if he'd heard something beneath the surface. Suddenly, Storm pawed at the ground beside the barn with unusual insistence. Nathan watched, puzzled, as the horse scraped away a patch of mud and straw until something metallic glinted in the dirt. Curiosity stirred in Nathan. He hauled himself upright and knelt beside Storm, brushing away the earth with careful fingers. There, half buried in the soil, was a battered tin box, its hinges rusted, the surface dulled by years beneath the ground. Nathan's breath caught. He hadn't expected to find anything valuable out here. He glanced at Storm, who seemed strangely pleased with himself, then turned his attention to the box. It took effort to pry the lid open, and for a moment Nathan thought it might crumble in his hands. But at last it yielded, groaning with the protest of age. Inside, a handful of items lay nestled together as if waiting for just this moment. Nathan lifted out a small stack of faded photographs, images blurred by time, but still holding the faces of people he could almost remember. A younger man with proud eyes and sawdust on his shirt. A child, grinning as she reached up to pet a horse remarkably like Storm. Nathan's chest tightened as he traced the outline of the little girl's smile, memories threatening to spill over. Beneath the photos rested a small wooden figurine, a horse carefully carved and polished smooth by countless hands. Nathan recognized the craftsmanship immediately, the fine, sure lines of his father's work, the same patient skill he'd tried to emulate all his life. The sight of it brought a bittersweet warmth, a bridge to days when he'd sat by his father's side in the workshop, learning how to shape wood into something lasting. He remembered the pride on his father's face, the sound of laughter in a home now silent. As Nathan sifted through the contents, his fingers brushed against a folded sheet of paper. He hesitated, then gently unfolded it, the paper fragile but the handwriting bold and unmistakable. The letter was addressed to him, his name written in the careful script he hadn't seen in years. He felt the sting of memory, a mix of hope and dread, as he read the words written by Rachel, his daughter. Even before he finished, Nathan knew the letter would become a turning point, though he couldn't yet grasp how. But before allowing himself to dwell on the letter's message, Nathan let the other treasures speak to him. He spread the photographs out in the weak sunlight, tracing each image as if he could will the past into the present. The faces of family, the presence of old friends, the echo of laughter on summer afternoons. All of it came rushing back, filling Nathan with a longing so deep it was almost painful. For a long time he sat quietly, the tin box in his lap and Storm standing beside him, both silent sentinels to memory and regret. The sun slid westward, shadows lengthening across the yard. Nathan realized that, in this unexpected discovery, he'd been given a gift, an invitation to remember who he'd been before loss and hardship had carved him down to the bone. The wooden horse, especially, reminded him of what mattered: patience, love, and the slow, careful building of something worthwhile. As he looked up at Storm, Nathan felt gratitude for his companion's instincts. Without Storm's persistence, the past might have remained buried for good. Evening brought a chill, but Nathan's spirit felt lighter. He returned the items to the box, save for the letter, which he tucked into his pocket. That night, as he sat by the low glow of an old lantern, Nathan finally allowed himself to hope. Not just for the wagon's restoration, but for the possibility of mending what had been broken between himself and his family. Storm rested his great head against Nathan's shoulder, a silent comfort. While outside, the world crept gently towards spring. And for the first time in a long while, Nathan believed that sometimes the past was not just a weight to bear, but a guide to what could still be saved. Night settled over the barn in heavy silence, the only sound the quiet shift of Storm's hooves on dry straw. Nathan sat alone, the old tin box beside him and the letter trembling in his hands. The lantern's golden light flickered, casting shadows that danced across the rough-hewn boards, illuminating the lines written by a hand he once knew better than his own. For a long while, Nathan hesitated to unfold the letter, his breath shallow and uneven, as if bracing for a blow he'd long expected. At last, he drew a slow breath and smoothed the paper across his knee, letting his eyes linger on the familiar loops of Rachel's script. The words, though simple, struck with a force that knocked the wind from him. "Dad, I know it's been a long time. I hope you'll read this. I'm writing because I'm going to be a mother, and I find myself wishing for your voice, your advice, your arms around me the way they were when I was a child. I want to believe we can find a way back. If you want to try, I do too." Nathan's world tilted. The grief and loneliness that had gripped him for years were suddenly joined by a fragile spark of hope. The thought of Rachel, his little girl, now grown, with a child of her own, brought back memories so vivid that for a moment he could almost hear her laughter echoing through the house, smell the scent of her hair as he carried her up to bed. But alongside hope came doubt, hard and biting. He remembered his failures, the words left unspoken, the days and nights when pride and stubbornness had been easier than forgiveness. He stared at the letter until the lantern guttered low, tracing every word as if searching for hidden meaning. What could he offer Rachel now, after all these wasted years? What would she want from a man who had failed her so completely? These questions gnawed at Nathan long into the night, crowding out sleep with restless energy. He rose from his bedroll, pacing the barn's dirt floor while Storm watched him, head cocked in silent concern. Nathan finally slumped beside Storm, resting his forehead against the horse's powerful neck. He spoke softly, confessing his fears to the only soul who had never left him. Storm, sensing his turmoil, shifted closer and rested his head on Nathan's shoulder. A silent pledge of loyalty, stronger than words could ever be. In that quiet communion, Nathan found a measure of peace. He ran his hand down Storm's mane, drawing comfort from the horse's steady warmth. The following morning dawned cold and clear, sunlight streaming through the barn's battered roof in golden beams. Nathan moved through his chores on autopilot, every task tinged with the awareness of Rachel's letter folded close to his heart. He tried to picture her as she must be now, older, wiser, a mother-to-be, but the image blurred with memory. Her childhood face never far from his mind. He spent the day lost in thought, his work on the wagon more deliberate than ever. He scrubbed away years of grime from the iron frame, every stroke of the wire brush releasing the past, bit by bit. Storm stood nearby. As always, a constant presence. Nathan found himself talking more, to Storm, to the barn, to the empty spaces around him. He replayed old conversations, imagined new ones, practiced apologies and confessions. Doubt still clung to him, whispering that he wasn't worthy of a second chance, that he would only let her down again. But the hope in Rachel's words refused to be snuffed out. Late that afternoon, as Nathan sifted through the wagon's battered compartments, searching for salvageable parts, he found himself drawn back to the wooden figurine he'd unearthed with the photographs. He cradled the little horse in his palm, feeling the careful grooves his father's knife had left behind. It was more than just a toy. It was a symbol of family, of tradition, of bonds that could be battered but never quite broken. Nathan turned it over and over in his hands, thinking of Rachel, of her unborn child, of all the things he'd left unsaid. That night, he sat again beneath the wavering lantern, letter and figurine before him. He whispered Storm's name, and the Mustang padded over, lowering his massive head beside Nathan's. The horse's presence gave him the courage to let go of regret, just for a moment, and imagine a future that might hold more than pain. Nathan closed his eyes, picturing Rachel reaching out to him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in forgiveness. The world outside was quiet, stars pricking the velvet sky beyond the barn's gaps. Nathan knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, paved with the hard work of mending what he'd broken. But as Storm settled beside him and sleep finally claimed him, Nathan felt a seed of hope take root in his heart. Maybe he could be the father Rachel needed. Maybe the story wasn't finished yet. And as dawn crept across the fields once more, Nathan rose with resolve, the letter close to his chest, ready to face whatever the day and his own future might bring. Nathan woke with a new heaviness in his chest, hope and dread warring inside him. The letter from Rachel felt like a lifeline tossed into stormy waters, but Nathan doubted his ability to grasp it. The thought of becoming a father and a grandfather in the same breath both inspired and terrified him. Yet with Storm nuzzling him awake, there was no time to lose himself in fears or dreams. Morning sunlight found its way through the barn's patched roof, the beams lighting motes of dust as Nathan hauled himself up to begin another day. Restoring the wagon became more than a way to pass the time. It was Nathan's act of penance, a test of endurance and hope. He attacked the work with a resolve born of desperation. The process was daunting. The frame was warped and infested with rot, and the iron bands around the wheels were corroded to thin ribbons. Nathan's hands, so skilled in years past, trembled now, both from cold and the deep ache left by old wounds. Every hammer swing, every measured cut of scavenged timber, came with a jolt of pain radiating from his war-battered shoulder down through his spine. Yet Nathan pressed on. He measured and sawed, scavenged for nails and bolts among the scrapyard's forgotten corners. Storm was never far away. The Mustang hauled what little lumber Nathan could find, his strength unflagging, his patience endless. Nathan had never realized just how much he relied on Storm, not only for muscle but for presence, for the comforting rhythm of hoofbeats and the unspoken reassurance of a companion who never judged. The nights were the hardest. Nathan often found himself lying awake on his thin bedroll, every muscle sore and his mind swamped with doubts. He worried about Rachel and the grandchild he had never met. What kind of welcome could he expect if he managed to finish the wagon and find his way back to her? He replayed the mistakes of his past, every harsh word and closed door, until regret threatened to crush him. Only the soft sounds of Storm chewing his hay or shifting in the dark kept Nathan tethered to the present, pulling him back from the brink. During the days, Nathan's work was often interrupted by the unexpected kindness of old Caleb. The scrapyard owner had never been one for small talk, but he understood hardship when he saw it. Now and then, Nathan would return to the barn to find a bundle of fresh rags, a new saw blade, or a handful of screws left on the wagon's tailgate. Sometimes, a steaming mug of coffee would appear on a crate by the door, its heat a small miracle on cold mornings. Caleb never lingered or demanded thanks, but his quiet support eased Nathan's burden in ways words never could. Nathan's progress on the wagon was slow but steady. Each day brought new challenges, bolts that snapped off in brittle wood, planks warped beyond repair, wheels that threatened to collapse under the slightest weight. There were moments when frustration flared, and Nathan would lash out, slamming a hammer or cursing the stubborn frame. But Storm would always draw near, his gentle eyes and steady breath calming Nathan's anger, reminding him that some things could only be mended with patience and persistence. One particular evening, after a day spent wrestling with a rusted axle, Nathan sat slumped in exhaustion, hands bleeding and spirit raw. The barn around him was quiet except for the faint creak of the wind in the rafters. Storm lay beside him, legs tucked under his powerful body, watching Nathan with unwavering loyalty. Nathan pressed his forehead to Storm's warm neck, tears stinging his eyes, feeling the weight of his own limitations and the enormity of the task ahead. Yet in the hush of the barn, surrounded by the evidence of struggle and survival, Nathan felt the stirrings of something new, a fragile but growing belief that he could begin again. With each passing day, the wagon took on new life. A broken side panel was replaced with a board carefully planed and fitted, its fresh grains stark against the old paint. A wheel, once frozen with rust, was coaxed back to movement, the result of hours of labor and stubborn hope. Nathan sanded the frame smooth, his fingers finding the flow of the wood, recalling the lessons his father had taught him so long ago. Through it all, Storm stood by, his presence as vital to the process as any tool Nathan wielded. Spring finally broke through, sunlight filling the barn with warmth and the scent of growing things. Nathan watched Storm graze in the greening field beside the barn, muscles rippling under a glossy coat. Nathan allowed himself a rare smile, pride mixing with longing. He knew there was still a long way to go, both for the wagon and for himself, but he had come further than he'd ever thought possible. The work, the pain, the small daily victories, all of it forged a stubborn hope inside Nathan. With Storm by his side and the wagon slowly mending beneath his hands, he began to believe that even the most broken things could be made new, that redemption was earned one careful act at a time. And as the days lengthened and the world warmed, Nathan prepared himself for the road ahead, ready to risk his heart for a second chance at family. The days blurred together as Nathan and Storm toiled through spring, the wagon slowly coming alive under Nathan's calloused hands. Each morning, sunlight spilled across the barn's battered roof, casting warm patterns that made Nathan believe, if only for a moment, that things might truly get better. The new wood in the wagon glowed pale gold, contrasting sharply with the dark, weathered planks that remained from its old life. Nathan took pride in every small accomplishment: a straightened axle, a panel sanded smooth, a wheel balanced just right. The old wagon's transformation mirrored his own, and that knowledge helped Nathan keep his doubts at bay. One afternoon, with the scent of wildflowers drifting through the open barn doors, Nathan was absorbed in his work, smoothing the wagon's side rails. Storm grazed nearby, tail swishing lazily at flies. Nathan barely registered the sound of approaching tires crunching on the gravel lane until a shadow fell across the barn entrance. He straightened, dusting sawdust from his sleeves, and glanced up. A faded blue sedan idled at the edge of the yard. The engine cut out, leaving only the soft tick of cooling metal. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Nathan's heart pounded against his ribs as the car door swung open. Rachel stepped out, uncertainty written across her face. She stood tall and hesitant, her hands resting on her belly, visibly pregnant. At her side, a teenage boy climbed out, jaw set, arms folded in tight defiance. Nathan knew, without a doubt, this must be Lucas, his grandson, though they'd never met. Nathan's breath caught. Time seemed to collapse. Memories of Rachel as a child overlapping with the woman standing before him now. His first instinct was to rush forward, but a tide of guilt rooted him to the ground. He had no right to expect forgiveness, not after the years lost to stubborn silence. Rachel met Nathan's gaze with a mixture of hope and wariness. Lucas hung back, suspicion plain on his face. An awkward, heavy silence stretched between them, the years apart pressing down like a physical weight. Nathan managed a nod of greeting, his throat too tight for words. Lucas glared at Nathan, suspicion hardening into anger. He was taller than Nathan expected, with Rachel's dark hair and the hard eyes of someone forced to grow up too soon. His fists clenched at his sides as he looked from the barn to Storm and then back to Nathan, as if weighing some invisible threat. Rachel stepped forward, breaking the standoff. She glanced around the barn, her eyes lingering on the half-finished wagon and the scattered tools, the evidence of Nathan's struggle and persistence. For a moment, something like nostalgia flickered across her face, an echo of memories, of rides on Storm's broad back, of laughter and safety Nathan could barely recall without pain. Lucas finally spoke, his words sharp and brittle as he accused Nathan of abandoning them, of not being there when Rachel needed him most. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow, striking sparks of regret and shame inside Nathan. He wanted to explain, to tell Lucas about his own battles, about pain and loss, but the words tangled on his tongue. He could only listen, absorbing the boy's anger, feeling every ounce of its truth. Rachel tried to mediate, her voice steady but tinged with pain. She spoke of the years alone, the distance that had grown like a wall between them, the hope that something, anything, might be salvaged now. Nathan nodded, swallowing hard, his own emotions barely contained. He knew this reunion would not be simple, that healing would not come from a single meeting. Old wounds festered, stubborn and deep. Storm, sensing the tension, wandered over and nudged Rachel gently, his warm breath stirring her hair. The familiar gesture seemed to thaw something in Rachel. She smiled despite herself, her hand reaching up to stroke Storm's nose, her fingers finding the spot she used to scratch as a little girl. The sight sent a jolt of memory through Nathan. Years ago, Rachel atop Storm, laughing, the world simple and full of possibility. Lucas hung back, but Storm turned to him next, lowering his great head until Lucas had no choice but to meet his gaze. There was challenge and invitation in the horse's eyes, a silent dare to let go of old anger, if only for a moment. Lucas shifted, discomfort flickering across his face, but he did not retreat. Nathan watched, hope rising tentatively. With the sun slipping lower, painting gold across the barn floor, Nathan found the courage to invite them both inside. He showed them the work he'd done on the wagon, the careful repairs, the new wood joined with the old, the way he'd tried to restore not just a relic, but a sense of belonging. Rachel ran her hand over the polished rail, her eyes shining with mixed emotion. Lucas, still wary, circled the wagon, inspecting Nathan's handiwork. He said little, but Nathan could see curiosity warring with resentment. For a brief instant, it was as if the possibility of family shimmered in the dusty air, fragile, uncertain, but present all the same. As dusk gathered outside, Nathan sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time, he was not walking it alone. Rachel and Lucas, Storm and the battered wagon, all of them together, suspended on the cusp of forgiveness. The hope of healing glimmering like the first stars pricking through the evening sky. The days following Rachel and Lucas's arrival slipped by with a tension that hummed just beneath the surface, an invisible current that Nathan could feel in every word, every glance, every heavy silence around the barn. Mornings came early. Nathan up before the sun, filling buckets of water for Storm and gathering what little he had for breakfast. His movements purposeful but guarded, as if afraid too much noise might shatter this fragile reunion. Rachel stayed in the barn's small loft, her silhouette a quiet presence above the work below. Lucas preferred to camp out near Storm, always at a slight distance from both Nathan and his mother, arms folded tight across his chest. The boy kept his gaze fixed on the horizon or the scattered tools by the wagon, rarely meeting Nathan's eyes. If he spoke, it was mostly to Rachel or unexpectedly to Storm. Storm became the bridge they all needed, moving easily among the rifts and misunderstandings. On the second morning, while Nathan struggled with a stubborn wheel bolt, he caught sight of Lucas kneeling in the straw, head bent, whispering into Storm's ear. The Mustang stood perfectly still, one ear cocked, as if considering every word. Nathan watched as Lucas finally, hesitantly, ran his palm along Storm's strong neck, the simple touch softening the tension that had been knotted in his posture since arrival. That small moment gave Nathan hope, a flicker, but enough. Rachel, too, found herself drawn back into old rhythms. She watched Storm with the affectionate expertise of someone who'd grown up alongside him, recalling childhood afternoons spent brushing his mane or learning to ride with her father's steady hand at the reins. Sometimes, without realizing it, she'd start humming a lullaby from her youth as she smoothed Storm's coat, the melody echoing in the barn's warm light. Nathan would pause, hidden from view, letting the sound anchor him in a bittersweet nostalgia. He remembered a much younger Rachel riding bareback in the summer heat, Storm's hooves drumming the earth as laughter rang out. Those were the days before anger and loss had come between them. Slowly, the boundaries between them began to soften, not with grand gestures, but in 1,000 small acts of care. Sharing apples with Storm, fixing a broken halter, working side by side to mend the wagon's battered bed. Lucas, whose resentment had been so sharp at first, was won over by Storm's unflinching patience. He started helping more, fetching tools or holding boards steady while Nathan hammered nails into place. Sometimes, Lucas would glance up to see if Nathan noticed his efforts. Nathan always made sure to nod, acknowledgement offered quietly, without making a fuss. Storm seemed to understand that his calm presence was needed now more than ever. He followed Lucas around the yard, nudging him gently whenever the boy seemed lost in thought. On one cloudy afternoon, Rachel and Lucas both laughed for the first time in days when Storm, eager for a treat, nuzzled into Lucas's pocket and nearly toppled him over. The barn filled with a kind of golden warmth, laughter rising to the rafters, if only for a moment. At night, the barn grew quiet, the sounds of insects and the soft shuffling of Storm settling in for the evening their only lullaby. Nathan found himself unable to sleep, lying on his back and staring at the beams overhead, wondering what the future held. He listened to the faint sound of Rachel's breathing in the loft, to Lucas's soft snores by Storm's stall, and let gratitude seep into his bones. There was still so much that needed to be said, apologies to be made, wounds that time alone couldn't heal. But the old Mustang was showing them the way, steadfast, patient, gentle even in his strength. The wagon restoration became a family effort, almost without anyone realizing it. Rachel took to sanding and painting. Careful not to overexert herself, but eager to help, she chose colors reminiscent of her childhood, coaxing life and memory back into the faded wood. Lucas grew more confident in his work, his hands finding a steady rhythm as he learned from Nathan's example. Sometimes Nathan caught him watching, curious, almost hungry, for instruction or a sign of approval. Nathan gave what he could, sharing advice in a low, steady voice, careful not to crowd the boy. One golden afternoon, as Rachel painted the last panel and Lucas polished the brass fittings, Nathan realized how much had changed since the day they'd arrived. There were still moments of tension, a misunderstanding here, a flare of old anger there. But the raw edges were softer now, the distance closing bit by bit. Storm, sensing the lightness, tossed his head and pranced in the field, inviting Lucas to chase him. The boy gave in, a wide smile finally breaking through his defenses as he ran, breathless and laughing, at Storm's heels. Nathan stood back, his heart full. In that moment, he understood that healing wasn't a sudden miracle, but a long process, one that required patience, forgiveness, and the kind of love that endured in spite of everything. Storm had given them that gift, wordlessly, simply by being there. The barn was still old, the wagon still bore its scars, and Nathan's regrets were far from gone. But in the soft spring sunlight, surrounded by the people and the horse he loved most, Nathan allowed himself, for the first time in years, to believe in a future worth fighting for. As the days warmed and the fields around the barn turned lush and green, Nathan felt a quiet transformation taking hold, not just in the battered wagon, but in the people who now called the barn home. The tension that had haunted the air was gradually replaced by a sense of gentle routine. Mornings began with shared chores. Rachel feeding Storm handfuls of oats, Lucas hauling water from the pump, Nathan tending to the smallest details on the wagon and making lists of what they still needed to finish. The barn was alive again, filled with the comforting clatter of tools, the sweet scent of sawdust, and the rhythmic thump of Storm's tail against the stall walls. It was during these long, peaceful days that Nathan's thoughts began to wander back to the little wooden horse figurine he'd found in the tin box, the gift his own father had carved so many years ago. He remembered the way his father's hands, rough and strong, would coax beauty out of the plainest scrap of wood, transforming it into something lasting, something meant to be held and treasured. Nathan realized, with a jolt of longing and love, that perhaps it was time to carry that tradition forward. The decision settled over him slowly, like a gentle rain. Late one afternoon, while Rachel napped in the loft and Lucas played quietly with Storm in the field. Nathan rummaged through his supplies and selected the finest piece of wood he had left. It was an old board from the barn itself, its grain tight and dense, carrying within it the memory of storms and sunlight and all the years that had passed since it was first cut. He set up his small workbench in the doorway where the light was best and began to carve. Each movement was deliberate, his father's lessons echoing in his mind. The knife bit into the wood, releasing the scent of fresh shavings and the familiar satisfaction that came from shaping something by hand. Nathan worked slowly, his fingers remembering the way to coax delicate shapes and smooth surfaces. At times his hands cramped, old wounds reminding him of battles fought and lost, but he persevered. The work became meditation, a way to pour out his love, his regret, and his hope for forgiveness with every careful stroke. As days passed, Nathan created not just one, but 3 small gifts, one for Rachel, one for Lucas, and one for the grandchild he had yet to meet. For Rachel, he carved a figure of a young girl riding a horse, her hair streaming back in a breeze that existed only in memory. The tiny face was lifted in joy, legs gripping the Mustang's sides, hands clinging to the reins, an image drawn straight from the happiest days of her childhood. For Lucas, Nathan shaped a sturdy horse mid-gallop, its muscles bunched, mane wild, embodying freedom and unspoken strength. And for the baby, he created a rocking horse small enough to fit in a crib, a promise carved in wood that family ties could endure, that old wounds could be healed. Storm was ever present during these hours, hovering close as if to supervise. Sometimes he would nose at Nathan's elbow or breathe softly over his shoulder, leaving a warm, reassuring presence. It was as though Storm sensed the weight of what Nathan was trying to do and offered his silent approval. Rachel noticed, too. When she woke from her rest, she'd pause at the top of the loft ladder and watch her father work, eyes shining with unshed tears, her hands unconsciously resting on her rounded belly. Lucas was more circumspect, pretending not to care, but Nathan often caught him sneaking glances, curiosity bright in his gaze. As the gifts neared completion, Nathan polished each one until the wood gleamed. He sanded away every rough edge, careful to make the figures smooth and safe. Late one night, under the yellow glow of the lantern, he wrapped the carvings in scraps of cloth and set them aside, ready for the day he would share them with his family. The act of giving, of creating something with his own hands, felt as important as any apology he could ever voice. The restoration of the wagon continued alongside this quiet project. Rachel grew more involved each day, painting bright wildflowers along the sides and adding her own touches to the design. Lucas helped Nathan bolt the seats in place and affix the iron hardware. With every shared task, the walls that had separated them grew thinner, patched over by sweat, laughter, and effort. It was during one of these afternoons, as Rachel carefully painted the last swirl of color on the wagon's side, that Nathan saw her smile, a real, unguarded smile, flash across her face. Lucas, watching her, grinned as well, a boyish energy overtaking his usual reserve. Storm, feeling the joy in the air, tossed his head and snorted, prancing in a circle around the yard, drawing laughter from all 3. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold over the fields, Nathan gathered his family together by the wagon. Storm stood quietly nearby, head bowed as if in blessing. Nathan handed out the gifts, one by one. No grand speeches, just the simple, heartfelt act of sharing what he'd made. Rachel wept as she traced her fingers over the carving of her younger self. Lucas clung to his horse, holding it tight. For a long moment, the four of them stood together in the golden light. A family bound not by perfection, but by love, effort, and the willingness to try again. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of paint, wood, and horse, Nathan understood. Redemption was possible, and sometimes all it took was the courage to offer something of your heart, carved, imperfect, but deeply real. With the gifts shared and the final touches painted on the wagon, a new sense of anticipation settled over the barn. The transformation, both of the battered vehicle and the family, was almost complete. Each plank that Nathan, Rachel, and Lucas fitted into place felt like another step toward healing, another stitch closing an old wound. For Nathan, every swing of the hammer and every careful brushstroke seemed to echo with memories, some painful, others full of hope. He knew the wagon would never be flawless, just as none of them could be, but that no longer seemed to matter. It was the work, the trying, the rebuilding that held meaning now. Nathan spent long hours inspecting every inch of the wagon. He tested the strength of the new axles, double-checked the seats and railings, and polished the brass fixtures until they shone in the sunlight. He took pride in the contrast between old and new, the marks of age and repair visible side by side. The wagon had become a symbol, not only of survival but of their shared effort, the sweat and perseverance poured into each repair a testament to their journey together. Rachel found herself drawn to the wagon more and more. She traced the wildflowers she'd painted on the sides, her fingertips lingering on the bright colors that stood out against the weathered wood. In the process, she remembered the summers of her youth, when she would ride Storm through tall grass, the wagon rumbling along behind her father. Now, with her own child soon to be born, Rachel saw in the wagon a promise that cycles could be broken, that families could be mended even after years of silence. Lucas, once so guarded and angry, now moved around the barn with a lighter step. He checked the wheels, climbed up and down the bench seats, and practiced handling Storm's reins. He even began to share stories of his own, about school, friends, and the dreams he'd once been too afraid to voice. Nathan listened quietly, offering a rare smile or word of encouragement when Lucas grew uncertain. It wasn't perfect. Old resentments still bubbled up from time to time. But the boy's defenses had softened, worn down not by lectures or apologies, but by the steady, unspoken presence of his family and the quiet magic of working side by side. On a warm afternoon, Nathan gathered his family around the finished wagon. He reached for the small wooden carvings, handing them to Rachel and Lucas. Each gift was accompanied by a quiet story, memories of Nathan's father, of Rachel's childhood rides, of the hope and love that had gone into every curve and detail. Rachel's eyes shone with tears as she hugged her father, the years of distance finally giving way to a wave of forgiveness. Lucas, holding his own horse carving, mumbled his thanks, his eyes downcast. But Nathan saw the gratitude written clearly on the boy's face. For Nathan, the moment was overwhelming. Years of guilt and longing had narrowed his world to little more than the inside of the barn and the weight of his regrets. But now, surrounded by the people he loved, people who had every reason to turn away and yet had chosen to stay, he felt something inside him finally give way. The forgiveness he received wasn't loud or showy. It was gentle, a softening in Rachel's voice, the way Lucas let himself lean into Nathan's embrace, the peace that seemed to settle over Storm as he watched the family reunite. The days that followed were marked by a lightness Nathan hadn't known in years. He and Lucas took Storm out for practice runs, testing the wagon's balance, laughing when bumps in the old road sent them bouncing in their seats. Rachel painted a small sign to hang at the back of the wagon, "Second Chances," the letters crooked but full of meaning. The barn, once a place of sorrow and solitude, was now alive with voices, laughter, and the promise of a new beginning. Nathan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, the desperation that led him to Caleb's scrapyard, the hopelessness he'd felt as he dragged the wagon out of the weeds, the silent nights when only Storm's steady breath had kept him anchored. He thought of the tin box, the letter from Rachel, and the slow, uncertain process of rebuilding trust. He understood now that forgiveness was not a single act, but a daily choice, a willingness to meet each other with patience and understanding, to build something new even on a foundation scarred by loss. One evening, as the family shared a simple meal beside the wagon, Nathan looked around at Rachel, Lucas, and the horse that had carried him through his darkest days. He saw not just what had been lost, but all that had been found. Resilience, hope, and the kind of love that endures even when it's bruised and battered. Storm grazed nearby, content in the fading light, a silent witness to their struggles and triumphs. As dusk fell, Nathan ran his hand along the wagon's polished side. He no longer saw only the scars, but the strength that came from facing them together. The wagon was ready. So was he. And as the stars appeared overhead, Nathan knew their story had turned a corner. The road ahead would not always be easy, but they would face it as a family, united by the lessons of forgiveness, hard work, and the courage to begin again. The morning of their departure arrived with a hush, the world wrapped in soft golden mist. Nathan awoke before dawn, the barn quiet except for the gentle snuffling of Storm and the slow, measured breathing of his family. For a moment he lay still, listening, letting the peace settle deep into his bones. The wagon stood ready just outside, gleaming in the pale light. No longer a relic of failure, but a testament to their shared endurance, a monument to second chances. Nathan moved quietly through the barn, gathering the last of their things. Rachel's bag with baby clothes and old photographs, Lucas's battered backpack, his own box of tools, and the small carvings he'd made for his family. He checked the wagon's wheels, ran his hands over the polished rails, and paused a long time with Storm, stroking the horse's neck. Storm looked back at him, eyes clear and calm, as if understanding that this journey was not just about leaving, but about beginning again. Rachel descended from the loft, her movements slow but steady. She placed a hand on her belly, smiling at Nathan with a quiet confidence that made him ache with gratitude. Lucas appeared at Storm's side, slipping the bridle over the Mustang's head with the easy affection of someone who'd learned to trust. The three of them moved about the barn, gathering blankets and supplies, the air buzzing with an unspoken sense of excitement and uncertainty. By sunrise, the wagon was loaded and ready, the final preparations complete. Nathan helped Rachel onto the bench seat, careful and attentive, then boosted Lucas up beside her. He glanced around the barn one last time, the memories of long nights and hard days flooding him with a bittersweet nostalgia. This place had been a crucible, where he'd been tested, where he'd nearly given up, where hope had taken root again in unexpected ways. Now, it was time to move forward. With Storm hitched to the wagon, Nathan climbed aboard, taking the reins in his hands. The leather felt familiar, worn but strong, much like himself. Storm shifted, muscles bunching in anticipation. Nathan took a steadying breath and flicked the reins gently, and with a snort and toss of his mane, Storm stepped out, pulling the wagon into the new day. The road ahead stretched wide and uncertain, but the air was clear and full of promise. Sunlight shimmered on the wildflowers growing at the edge of the fields. Birds rose in startled flocks from the grass, scattering before the steady clip-clop of Storm's hooves. Lucas pointed out the first blue heron gliding over the creek, and Rachel laughed, a sound that filled Nathan's heart with hope. He glanced at his daughter, her hand resting protectively over her unborn child. Her eyes bright as she took in the world from the seat of the family wagon. They passed through the quiet town, people pausing to watch as the wagon rolled by. Caleb, the scrapyard owner, stood at the gate, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he tipped his hat. Nathan nodded back, a silent thank you passing between old friends. For a moment, he caught his reflection in a shop window. Storm proud and strong at the lead, Rachel and Lucas beside him. The wagon shining in the light, and he saw not the broken man he once was, but a father and grandfather moving forward with the ones he loved. The countryside unfolded before them, the horizon wide and welcoming. The road twisted through stands of oak and cottonwood, past the pond where Nathan had once taught Rachel to fish. Memories rose and fell, but this time they were bittersweet, not suffocating. Lucas, seeing a field of wild horses in the distance, begged Nathan to stop for a while. They climbed down, watching the herd thunder across the plain, Storm prancing in excitement, as if remembering his own wild youth. Rachel rested in the grass, leaning back against the wagon wheel, her face soft with peace. Nathan let his gaze travel across his family, his heart full to bursting. The journey had been long and hard, the losses deep, but here on the open road, he felt the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. The scars remained, reminders of struggle, of lessons hard won, but the anger and sorrow had faded, replaced by forgiveness, resilience, and love. They had rebuilt not just a wagon, but themselves. As evening approached, they made camp beneath a sky streaked with purple and gold. Nathan set a small fire and watched the flames dance. Lucas curled up beside Storm, who stood guard with quiet dignity. Rachel sat close, her hand in Nathan's, the silence between them comfortable at last. They shared a simple meal, laughter rising and falling like music, stories told in the hush of twilight. Nathan looked up at the stars, feeling the immensity of the world and the smallness of their wagon, yet grateful for both. They were together, changed, yes, but whole. The open road beckoned, full of possibility. As the last embers faded and the night wrapped them in gentle darkness, Nathan pulled his family close, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as one. Storm snorted softly, shifting his weight, and Nathan smiled. The horse had carried him from despair to hope, across broken ground to a new beginning. In the morning, they would travel on, the wagon creaking with every mile, the world wide and wild before them. For Nathan, Rachel, Lucas, and the child to come, it was more than a journey. It was a promise that even the most battered hearts could find their way home again. And so, with the dawn, the family set out together, united, resilient, and filled with the quiet, hard-earned joy that comes from forgiveness and the courage to begin anew. Storm led the way, proud and unhurried, the wagon behind him a rolling testament to the power of second chances.